Previously on the Apollo mission, two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in a battle for dominance. Then, the Soviets took the world by surprise, igniting the space race with the launch of the first artificial satellite.
On October the 4th, 1957, while the Americans were still finalizing their plans, Sputnik was launched.
Then, they sent the first human into orbit. America wanted to win, declaring a bold mission.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon.
With this promise, the Apollo program began. After years of effort, Apollo 1 stood ready for launch, but fate had other plans. Tragedy struck, leaving everything in ruins. Now America must start over, but how? After the Apollo 1 fire, the loss of Grissom, White, and Chaffee devastated NASA and the American public. The deaths of these three astronauts left an indelible mark on the program and created widespread doubt about NASA's capabilities and commitment to safety. NASA was under intense scrutiny. In order to rebuild trust, both among their scientists and the American people, they had to act quickly and decisively. NASA formed a special Apollo 1 review board to investigate the causes of the fire. After extensive research and analysis, they found the flaws. Now they had to fix them. The cabin was redesigned with non-flammable materials, the hatch was re-engineered to open more easily in emergencies, and new safety measures were implemented throughout the spacecraft. They also made significant improvements in training and astronaut procedures to ensure that everyone was fully prepared. At this point, NASA had no choice but to halt their original plans for Apollo mission. Apollo 2 was initially planned as a mission to test the Apollo command module in space, but it was canceled. Apollo 3, originally planned to be a similar mission, was also scrapped for the same reason. The focus had to shift towards safety, ensuring that the spacecraft was fully ready before any more crewed flights took place. During this downtime, NASA also pushed forward with several unmanned missions that would help test components of the Apollo program. The key objective was to work on the Lunar module, LM, which would eventually land astronauts on the moon. Unmanned spacecraft like Lunar 9 and Surveyor missions were launched in parallel, providing crucial data and showing that space exploration was moving forward regardless of the setbacks. The suspension of Apollo 2 and 3 allowed NASA to rethink their approach. They took their time, addressed every failure head-on, and put safety at the forefront of the entire program. While NASA was grappling with the aftermath of Apollo 1, the Soviet Union continued making significant strides in their space program. Quiet and calculating, they didn't let the tragedy at NASA slow them down. In October 1967, the Soviets launched Venera 4, the first spacecraft to successfully transmit data from another planet. It entered Venus's atmosphere, sending back vital scientific information before losing contact, further demonstrating Soviet advancements in space exploration. Despite these successes, the Soviets faced their own setbacks. Their lunar landing program was plagued by delays, secrecy, and failures. While they continued to work toward a crewed moon landing, much of their progress remained under the radar, largely unnoticed by the global media. This only added pressure on NASA, which, despite its setbacks, needed to push forward to prove it could reach the moon before the Soviets. And the matter of fact is, no one knew just what the Soviets were truly working on. Despite all this, NASA had to stay focused on its objectives. The Apollo 4 mission became a crucial step toward the moon, but there was fear in their hearts. What if they failed again? What if it didn't work?
5, 4, we have ignition. All engines are running. We have liftoff. We have liftoff at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Launched on November 9, 1967, Apollo 4 was the first uncrewed test flight of the Apollo spacecraft, testing the redesigned command and service modules and the new Saturn V rocket, which would be critical for launching Apollo astronauts to the moon. Apollo 4 wasn't just another test flight, it was a bold demonstration. NASA needed to prove that the spacecraft, rocket, and everything in between were ready for the manned missions ahead. The Saturn V rocket, the largest and most powerful rocket ever built at that time, performed flawlessly, and the command module completed multiple orbits around Earth before re-entering the atmosphere. Apollo 4 was not just a success, it was essential for rebuilding public confidence. NASA was showing the world that despite its setbacks, they were still on track to land on the moon. With the success of Apollo 4, NASA regained some of its confidence, but the journey to the moon was far from over. The next critical step was ensuring that the spacecraft would not only work in theory, but in the harsh realities of space. Apollo 5 became a crucial mission in this process. Then just 2 months later, NASA launched again.
5, 4, 3, ignition plan. Ignition detected.
In January 1968, Apollo 5 marked the first test of the lunar module, which would be used for landing astronauts on the moon. Unlike previous missions, this was a daring, unmanned flight that focused on testing the lunar module's engine and systems in space. The mission was a success, although not without some issues. But Apollo 5 proved that the lunar module could function in the vacuum of space, something NASA needed to verify before putting astronauts aboard. During this period, the Soviet Union pushed forward with its lunar ambitions in secrecy. Though they never publicly announced a manned moon mission, their engineers were racing to develop the N-1 rocket, a behemoth designed to rival NASA's Saturn V. But technical failures and limited funding plagued their efforts. By 1968, their hopes of beating the United States were fading, yet they pressed on, still determined to leave their mark on the moon. Meanwhile, NASA prepared for its next major challenge, Apollo 6. One more test stood between them and the first crewed Apollo mission. If this failed, everything they had worked for could come crashing down. This mission had one goal: prove that the Saturn V was ready in a full flight. As the world watched with anticipation, Apollo 6 lifted off in April 1968 from the Kennedy Space Center. This was the mission that would test the capabilities of the mighty Saturn V rocket, the very same rocket that would one day carry astronauts to the moon. Everything was riding on this flight. But from the very start, things went wrong. The first stage roared to life, but soon problems emerged. One of the engines malfunctioned, losing power and sending shockwaves through the rocket. The resulting vibrations caused a phenomenon known as pogo oscillations. The rocket shook violently, sending tremors through the spacecraft and putting immense strain on its structure. It was a terrifying moment, one that could have shattered the mission entirely. But that wasn't the only problem. As the second stage ignited, it too experienced difficulties. The violent vibrations from the first stage had transferred to the second stage, affecting its performance. Though the second stage managed to complete its burn, the flight was far from flawless. NASA's engineers were on edge, knowing that each failure raised more questions than answers. Despite these issues, Apollo 6 continued its journey into space and passed most of the mission objectives, though it was clear that the Saturn V rocket had issues to address. Since this was an uncrewed test, there were no astronauts to worry about. However, re-entry was still a tense moment. The capsule successfully re-entered Earth's atmosphere and splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. Minor concerns were noted with the heat shield and structural integrity, but nothing catastrophic occurred. The spacecraft was retrieved successfully, and while the flight was only a partial success, it demonstrated that the capsule itself could endure the rigors of spaceflight. After the failure of Apollo 6, NASA faced a harsh reality. The mission showed that while the Saturn V could still reach space, critical issues needed fixing. The pressure mounted. They couldn't afford another failure. Engineers worked tirelessly to correct the problems, but the schedule didn't change. Apollo 7, the first crewed mission, was still set for October 1968. There was no room for error. The moon was still in sight, and NASA couldn't afford to miss the mark again. With the failures of Apollo 6 still fresh in their minds, NASA had no room for mistakes. The next mission would be different. It wouldn't just be another test flight. For the first time since the Apollo 1 tragedy, astronauts would fly into space. The world was watching. Would NASA prove that Apollo was finally ready? October 11, 1968. The launch pad stood ready. 3 astronauts, Wally Schirra, Don Eisel, and Walter Cunningham, were about to embark on a mission that could make or break the moon landing effort. Their goal? To test the Apollo Command and Service Module in Earth orbit and prove that it was safe for human spaceflight. The Saturn 1B rocket ignited, lifting Apollo 7 into the sky. The ascent was flawless. For the first time, an Apollo spacecraft carried humans beyond the atmosphere. But this wasn't just a simple test flight. Over the next 11 days, the crew would push the spacecraft to its limits, testing its navigation, life support systems, and ability to dock with a lunar module, one that wasn't even there yet. Everything needed to work perfectly, and for the most part, it did. The spacecraft performed well, demonstrating that Apollo was finally ready to take humans farther than ever before. But the mission wasn't without its challenges. The crew, especially Mission Commander Wally Schirra, struggled with head colds in the cramped environment. Tempers flared between the astronauts and mission control, with Schirra often dismissing orders he felt were unnecessary. Despite tensions, Apollo 7 succeeded in its primary mission. The spacecraft maneuvered flawlessly. Communication tests with Earth were successful, and for the first time, a live television broadcast was sent from an American spacecraft. The world watched as Apollo 7 became the first step toward the moon. On October 22, after 163 orbits around Earth, Apollo 7 returned home. The capsule plunged through the atmosphere, its heat shield glowing red hot before splashing down in the Atlantic Ocean. The mission was complete. NASA had done it. They had finally flown Apollo with a crew and proved that the spacecraft was ready. With Apollo 7's success, the next step was clear. The time had come to leave Earth's orbit. The next mission would go where no human had gone before, toward the moon. So, that's it for today's episode. We've covered some crucial moments in the Apollo program, but the journey to the moon was far from over. Be sure to stay tuned for the next chapter, where we continue the story of humanity's bold leap into space. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more updates. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.